Yes.
Okay, good. Let me start with a thinking experiment. So these are mist nets. Many of you might know them. If you are an ornithologist and you need birds in your hand to do some studies on them or to put a ring on their legs, you usually use these mist nets. We put them out in nature somewhere. The birds fly at both sides of the nets and they don't see the net, or at least they act like they don't see the net. And if they want to cross to the other side, they fly into the net. And we can get them out there and do this, of course, as fast as possible. If I want to do that, I need a couple of permits to do so. I need a special training, a certification as a bird ringer, and a lot of other things, which is quite good because it is dangerous for the birds, of course, to fly into these nets. If we wouldn't take them off, they, of course, would die in there. That's why there are strong regulations. We have to check every 45 minutes or every hour at least, or something like that. Then the bird that is trapped is handled. It got a ring. We do some measurements and then release it. Now imagine, and of course, if I finish that field work, I have to tear down the net and take it with me home. Now imagine I would decide to go into holidays and just leave these nets open in the field. And then maybe afterwards I have other things to do. So I leave these nets for months and probably even for a year. Can you imagine what a hell of a scandal that would be? I will be fined, I will be taken to court. I even might be imprisoned if I do that for a long time and at several places. So it's a completely unthinkable thing. Now, if we exchange these nets with glass, put that glass outside, the birds fly on both sides of the glass, they cross, they crash against the glass because they can't see it and they die. Would there be a scandal or not? Rather not, maybe among us because we know about this, but otherwise we see exactly that all over in nature and not much happens. Think of all these glass structures we put out in nature, mostly with the intention that the structure we are building is not too visible. Therefore we use glass, but unfortunately it's also not visible for the birds then. If I'm an architect, I even might get a prize for hiding such obstacles somewhere in nature. And for the birds, this is a serious problem. Modern architecture means a lot of glass everywhere, as we are all aware of. And the problem is really big. So this data is not new, but I think the proportions still are the same. People in America try to figure out where do most of our birds die, and buildings is one reason here. Power lines, automobiles, which means traffic victims, pesticides, all kinds of things. And you see the buildings, which includes the window collisions, so the glass panes, makes up more than 50% of the causes of death that they investigated at that time. And there's a lot more data about that. So Dan Clem estimated for the United States about 1,000 million bird collisions on glass panels per year. The BTO for Great Britain, 100 million collisions per year. They estimated a third of them ending with the death of the bird. Hans Schmidt in Switzerland estimated 15 million collisions per year. That's quite consistent considering the size of the countries. And in Germany, the Working Group of Bird Conservation Authorities, with a strong contribution of Clemens Steyhoff, who is talking next here in our event, they estimated 100 to 115 million bird collisions per year. And they did not take into account bus shelters, noise protection walls, etc., so just buildings. Interestingly, they assume that a collision is always a death case. And from that, they calculated a mortality rate of between 5 and 10% of all German birds due to glass collisions. So this is really an important thing. It does not necessarily hit the very rare species, but it just is a constant loss of lives among the birds. Here is another way to show that a bit. That's the situation for Germany. So the bigger the words are printed, the more important this factor is on the population size of birds in Germany. That is not based on real numbers, it's based on estimations or guesstimations probably. And you see, of course, we have this big habitat loss in the open landscape problem that is still among all other, but then also quite big on the screen is the glass bottom right, and many other things that are far more in the discussion, for instance, like deliberate killing, are, if you just count lives that are lost, are less important. I don't, by far, I don't say they are not important, but if we just count lives, the glass problem is larger than the illegal killing problem. But if you follow the discussions among bird conservation scene, you got the opposite impression. Now, what is the problem? It's two things that we have to think of. One is the transparency of glass. So this is, of course, the main feature of glass, that you can see through it, which means that you can't see the structure as such. And the second problem is reflection. So under certain angles, you can see the environment around the glass mirrored on the glass. And any bird who wants to reach one of these trees or branches that are mirrored, of course, will also crash into the glass panel. The main problem is that birds behave like they do not recognize glass as an obstacle. It's like, for them, it's like being air, but the air is solid, and therefore it's a deadly obstacle for them. We know that more bird activity means more bird collisions, which means when there are more birds or the birds are more active, the risk increases. We know that larger area of glass mean more bird collisions. And the collision rates are not depending on sex and age of the birds, and they only poorly depend on species or conditions. So it's a problem for all of them. We know that because mainly because Daniel Clem in the United States did a lot of good and very pioneering work about that. And there's a couple of good publications from his side if you wanted to hear more about that. Some more interesting things found by Daniel Clem were that if you increase 10% the glass in a facade of a building by 10%, you get an increase of almost 20% bird collision risk. If you have 10% more higher vegetation on the ground, you increase by 13% the collision risk. And if you have 10% higher trees, you increase even by 30, but by a third, the bird collision risk. So I think it's pretty clear where the thing is going to. And the main facts that are needed to do something, they are known. We have to remember to understand all that birds see their environment differently from us. This is something that needs to be kept in mind. The same applies for the question why birds crash into wind power plants. They are really not invisible, but still that might happen, but it's a different story. In the center of the problem is that really birds have a different way of sensing the environment. They are strongly based on visual observation. So the eyes are probably the most important sensor of birds. But even there we have a difference. So if you look at that graph, the upper part shows the three types of light sensitive rods in the retina in humans spread over different wavelengths. So we have these typical three types of rods that form our color vision. And below, that's the same situation in the retina of a starling. We see four of these rods, and we see they are at different wavelengths. So the color composition must be completely different for a starling when he looks at the same thing as we look at. And we see on the very left side, which is the ultraviolet side, there is more sensor activity, obviously, than in humans, which means birds have also a wider range of light sensitivity. This must, as I said, result in a completely different coloration of the environment. And if we see where the eyes of the birds look to, the usual situation is shown here. So the eyes point at both sides, so almost 360 degrees can be seen, which is important for a bird that might be hunted by other animals regularly. And just in front of the beak, there's even a blind area where birds can't see anything. And the overlap is between 0 and very small. If we look at the situation of a human, that's this tiny graph on the bottom right, we have, of course, very strong oriented side towards front of us, and we have a large overlap. And of course, you know, this overlap between two eyes is very important to estimate the distance of an object. So this is something that birds for sure cannot do as good as we do, because they rarely have any overlap of their two visual fields of the two eyes. They can do that by the movement of the object over the retina and things like that, but it must be completely different from what we do. So this means even if we think, well, if you concentrate a bit, you of course can see that glass panel, it's by far not guaranteed that the birds can do the same. What are the circumstances of bird collisions with windows? So first we can have this normal flight from A to B. If there's the glass panel between A and B, the bird will not see it and crash into it, or it will see a mirrored part of the environment and therefore crash into the glass. The second typical situation are panic flights. So birds, for instance, birds in feeders in gardens, they may exactly know where the glass is or where at least obstacles are. But then if the sparrowhawk comes around the corner and they just don't care where what is, they just fly in all directions, and then they also crash into the window because this looks like the easier way to escape than probably a wall or so. And the third situation that is connected to the mirror character of glass, birds can see rivals, conspecifics in the mirror of the glass, and there are cases where especially certain bird species spend hours or days fighting against their imaginary rival in a mirror. This is mostly not deadly, but it can use up a lot of time. So if this bird spends half the day in fighting against an imaginary rival, instead of doing things that make more sense, that can also have an impact, of course. There's quite a lot of information around. So in Europe, I think this website, Vogelglas Info, holds most information. Only a small part of it is in English, unfortunately, but if you have the possibility somehow to use maybe internet translation programs or so, this is for sure a very, very good address to find resources and informations. Also, I have to mention the Wiener Umweltanwaltschaft. That's the authority for the environment in Vienna, in Austria. They have a lot of, especially of tested solutions on their websites. And there's also English information in English language, for instance, by the American Bird Conservancy. So it's abcbirds.org, and then something with glass, you will be guided to that. There's also a lot of resources there that can help you to approach the problem. Of course, the most obvious thing is always gluing some raptor stickers on the glass panel. And I think all of us here know that this is not working at all. Surprisingly, no one else seems to know that, because we still see hundreds or thousands or millions of these bird stickers on the glass panel. So birds definitely don't think this is a raptor. What birds can see here is that there's something black on something transparent. Transparent might not even be seen. So the more stickers you put on the glass, the better the protection is, of course. So from a third onwards, it makes sense. So a third of covered area. But you don't need to use raptor stickers. You can also use dots or stripes, and there are much nicer solutions. Meanwhile, I come to that in a minute. So it's not a question of chasing the birds away because they think here's a lot of raptors. It's just a question of how much of the glass is covered by these things that are glued on. So that is definitely not the solution. And if there's 1 or 2 stickers on a huge glass panel, it's just useless. It does not work. So how can we measure the effectivity of prevention measures? One is monitoring. So this is clearly the focus of the next talk. I'm not going to talk about that. Second is flight tunnel tests of glass marks. And that is something that needs a few words to understand it. The idea is that we make a two-way choice test with a bird. The traditional, very traditional way that thing was developed in our institute long ago. is that you release a bird in a flight tunnel, and this bird wants to escape from the tunnel, and it flies towards a glass area, and this glass area is divided between a test panel where you can do something, put dots on it or stripes or whatever, and the control panel that is just a plain glass. And the bird, of course, will leave this tunnel and may go for the gap where it thinks it can go through. This tells us whether the bird sees that the test panel has some marking on it and is an obstacle, and then it may go for the control panel. So in order to avoid that the bird really crashes into the panel, there's usually a net in front of it. And the situation is, of course, inverse from the real situation, because usually birds come from outside, not from inside. Therefore, you have to put light from the correct side to this glass panel. Traditionally, this was done with daylight bulbs. Meanwhile, there's a lot of other techniques using mirrors to bring daylight on the correct side of the panel. So that's the main principle. This very basic approach has been developed much farther on. There's one huge of these flight tunnels in Eastern Austria. Another one is in Powder Mill in the United States, and a couple more are known. So that can be turned according to the sun position. Here are these big mirrors. So there's a lot of thoughts involved in these things to make a good setup for testing the efficiency of glass marking. There are 3 problems that are not we could not overcome. Unfortunately, here's exactly the a message on front of my, sorry. Okay, so we have, of course, technical artifacts. So we still don't have exactly the situation that we have on a building, because birds still come from the wrong side, and we have to see how light goes to the glass panel. We have to make sure that this light has the same composition of wavelength as the real light. This is even a problem with mirrors, because also mirrors don't really reflect everything. So this is one problem that is still not completely solved. The other problem is the motivation for these birds is panic, which is not always the case out in nature. Birds don't always make panic flights. They can also crash into windows during the quite normal flights, which we cannot simulate in this setup. Of course, according to EU legislation, this whole thing is not an experiment, which needs really, really a lot of administrational effort to get the permit to do so. But it's all we have at the moment as experimental setups, so we need to use it, but there's a strong need to develop better measures to really find out what are good and what are bad strategies against window collisions. For simulating something like a transparent noise protection wall, we also tried things like that. So here's 4 glass panels. In the background, there's a shelter, and on the other side, we put feeders, and the birds that wanted to cross the area between the feeder and the shelter, they had to select where they want to go through, and they will certainly not go through at the place where they see an obstacle. Here is a marking. This is in the UV area, a marking. And here's no marking, but a glass panel, and the birds should try to go through here if they really see that is an obstacle, and they should try to go through everywhere if they don't recognize this as an obstacle. Of course, also here we need these mist nets to prevent the birds from really crashing into the windows, which might be deadly. So that is the third possibility, do field tests, but they are, of course, a lot of effort. And if you test a lot of these glass panels, you end up with suggestions like these ones. They have been tested, and some are very good. And we see that, for instance, stripes in different colors and of different structures have a different efficiency. There's a lot of knowledge about that already. And a good way to find them is on the website of this Wiener Umweltanwaltschaft. There are quite nice solutions. Individual solutions, so protecting glass against bird strike, or protecting birds against bird strike, is not always something that is ugly. It can be really nice or smart. The earlier you think about the problem, the better it is. There are hundreds of possibilities where birds can crash into. There's more in the next talk about that. Important is avoid glass, reduce glass, and where you can't do that, mark the glass, but mark it in an efficient way, not just the raptor sticker on it. And now, two other aspects are don't lure birds to dangerous glass panels, and better avoid these general glass panels at all. Here are a few more examples. Avoid glass. It is possible to build nice buildings with less glass than we often see. Glass can be partitioned in the traditional way or in a new way, so the area is smaller and therefore easier to recognize. Glass can be covered. This might also be interesting in terms of climate change. If it's getting hotter, we don't want all this heat going through the glass into the buildings. And there's also the discussion about tilting the glass panes, but there's not much known about the effect size. Probably that doesn't help at all. And certainly it depends a lot on the situation around the building. The main idea here is to reduce the mirror effect. But as I said, it's not really clear whether it works or not. And then there's a question in the gardens. Of course, a common question is, what about bird feeders? Bird feeders should either be at least 10 meters away from the glass, or they should be directly at the glass, because the birds will fly slowly here anyways, because they want to land somewhere here. But otherwise, if you put it 2 or 3 meters away from the glass panels, you just create an attraction point, and you will have more bird activity in that area, and this increases the risk of collision. That has shown here. That's the amount of fatal strikes, and that is the feeder placement in meters from the panel. And if you are closer than 1 meter to your glass, you have almost no strikes, and if you are 5 meters, you already increase the strike risk by more than half. And of course, don't offer attractive targets behind glass panes. That looks very cool, but every bird that comes here and sees that nice green in the back, it will necessarily die, because it crashes before it reaches this green area. It crashes into the glass of that winter garden. Anti-reflective glass is not the solution. That is very important to say, because that's what architects usually bring first on the desk. Yes, we have anti-reflective glass, because even the glass that is highly anti-reflective under technical terms may reflect a lot of the environment and may still be a problem. And the less reflexes you have, the more transparency you have. And depending on what the real problem at that place is, you can even make the thing worse. So for instance, here, this connection aisle between 2 buildings with glass on both sides, I think this is clearly a transparency problem, because birds want to fly through here. They can see through the whole thing. And that very obviously anti-reflection glass will not help anything here. And in many other cases also not. So in some cases it can be a part of the solution, but it's definitely not the solution that needs to be done first. So, and last point, that was so far everything that happens during the day. But we also can have a collision problem during the night, and then we have light involved to that. This is known for a long time. So that's a building from the lighthouse on an island in the North Sea on a cloudy night, and there's thousands of birds crashing to that lighthouse. That is known for a long time and has been described. And even here in buildings along the coast in Chicago, it has been calculated that during spring and fall migration, more than 1,500 birds can die on a single building because they crash into the windows. What's the problem there? Many bird species migrate during the night, and during the night they are attracted by artificial light. That is, if visibility is bad, which is usually due to clouds or to fog, then it's a good strategy to go to the place where it's more light, because this is usually above the fog, if it's natural moonlight, for instance. But if we have artificial light, this is of course misleading, and the birds that go towards the light, they are really lured by the light, and they of course have to fly in a certain speed, even if they don't see anything, otherwise they would fall down. And with that speed, they just crash into the artificial light source then. And this is, as I said, particularly a problem in foggy and rainy nights when the birds need that orientation towards the lighter areas in their surrounding. And there can be light dome effect in inside. In the worst case, they crash into the window. In the less worst case, they spend all night in that light dome and can't escape, which means a lot of energy loss and time loss, which can be a problem for migrating birds as well. And if we have strong light beams in the surrounding of airports, for instance, or on towers or so, you can really see how the birds are trapped in these light beams and approach lights on huge buildings in migration nights, especially in migration nights with bad visibility. This reduces the problem a bit, but of course you can't make a whole city being dark, even if they try it. So this is still a problem that needs awareness. There's much more awareness in the States and in Canada than in Europe, which also has to do with the structures. Metropole cities directly at coasts with constantly bad weather around, like in Chicago or so. So the problem might be there, but it's less prominent than in the state, probably. But it's also a problem of, finally, of collisions with man-made structures. As I said, that is more a problem in the night, and the window collisions due to transparent for your attention, and I hand back to Elpida.